Shaquille O'Neal walked into a luxury car dealership in the heart of Los Angeles, dressed simply. His casual attire gave no hint of his legendary career. The interior of the dealership sparkled with crystal chandeliers and marble floors, reflecting the elegance of the high-end vehicles displayed like works of art. He moved slowly, his eyes landing on a vintage car tucked in a corner. His calm demeanor suggested he wished to avoid attention, but before he could get closer, a disdainful voice rang out from behind him. "Are you sure you can afford to be in here?" The sharp question came from the manager, whose eyes brimmed with judgment, as if one glance was enough to appraise a person's worth. What happened next would not only leave everyone in the dealership stunned, but also deliver an unforgettable lesson. Before continuing the story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any more inspiring videos. The sun had just risen over the Los Angeles skyline, its first rays gently spilling through the towering buildings, painting every street corner in gold. The morning air was crisp, filled with the vibrant sounds of a city coming to life. Shaquille O'Neal, towering as always, strolled down a familiar street. He was dressed simply, in a way that could make anyone overlook the fact that he was a basketball legend, a man who was not just an icon on the court, but also in the hearts of the public. Shaq walked slowly, his face calm, though his eyes gleamed with focus. He stopped in front of a small corner coffee shop with a weathered sign that exuded charm. The glass door swung open with the jingle of a bell, and the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee filled the air. "Shaq, my hero!" Mike, the barista in his signature green apron, looked up and greeted him with a wide grin, his voice tinged with humor. Shaq chuckled, leaning down to exchange a friendly handshake with Mike, their routine like that of old friends. "Good morning, Mike. The usual, please. Latte with a little extra foam." "Sure thing, big guy. But what are you up to today? Don't tell me you're planning another slam dunk session at the local court," Mike quipped as he started preparing the drink. Shaq shook his head, a faint smile crossing his lips. "No, today's special. I'm looking for something more meaningful." Mike paused, curiosity flashing across his face. "Meaningful? What do you mean?" Shaq lowered his head slightly, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone. "I'm searching for a vintage car, Mike, not just to collect or show off. I want it to symbolize something bigger, a project I'm working on. Something that, when people see it, reminds them of what we can achieve together: community, hope, and giving back." Mike smiled knowingly, sliding the coffee across the counter. "You always think bigger than anyone I've ever met, Shaq. I hope you find what you're looking for." Shaq nodded his thanks, taking the cup and stepping back out onto the sidewalk. He stood there for a moment, sipping the warm latte and taking in the rhythm of the city. Cars sped by, bicycle bells chimed, and the laughter of young people filled the air, an orchestra of life unfolding around him. Inside Shaq, a quiet resolve was forming. Today, his quest to find that special car would begin, and he believed it wouldn't just be a personal journey, it would touch countless lives. With that thought in mind, Shaq stepped forward, merging into the bustling crowd, a simple man with grand dreams in his heart. Here's the translation into American English. Shaq took a final sip of his coffee before tossing the empty cup into a trash can on the sidewalk. He stood still for a few moments, gazing up at the towering glass structure in front of him. Morrison's Auto Emporium, a luxury car dealership famous for housing some of the rarest, most expensive vehicles in the world. The gleaming metallic sign reflected the morning sunlight, exuding a glamorous aura meant to overwhelm anyone who laid eyes on it. Shaq smiled, drew in a deep breath, and pushed open the heavy glass doors. Inside, opulence reigned supreme. Everything, from the marble floors to the contemporary art adorning the walls, screamed that this was no place for the ordinary. The scent of new leather mingled with high-end cologne, reinforcing the air of exclusivity. A few sharply dressed salespeople engaged in quiet conversations with equally well-dressed clients, their expressions a mixture of smugness and self-importance, as though their presence alone was a proof of their elevated social standing. Shaq, clad in a simple hoodie and jeans, stepped inside. His tall, muscular frame was impossible to miss, yet his casual attire made him stick out like a sore thumb. Several pairs of eyes darted in his direction, then quickly looked away, accompanied by hushed whispers. At the center of the showroom, Richard Morrison, the dealership's owner, was engrossed in conversation with a female client, his hand resting lightly on a brand-new sports car. A middle-aged man with impeccably styled hair and a tailored suit that fit like a second skin, Richard exuded a refined, calculated air. His smile was polite, but his sharp eyes constantly evaluated the worth of everything and everyone around him. When Richard's gaze landed on Shaq, his smile briefly flickered, replaced by a glint of suspicion. Without a word, he gave a slight nod toward a nearby employee, signaling them to handle the unexpected visitor. Shaq appeared oblivious to the chill in the air as he strolled leisurely past rows of gleaming luxury cars. Each vehicle was a masterpiece, from sleek modern sports cars with bold lines to elegantly restored vintage classics. But it was a car in a far corner of the room that caught Shaq's attention. A black vintage car resting atop a rotating platform. The car's lines were exquisite, every detail meticulously crafted, from the door frames to the iconic emblem. Through the glossy paint, Shaq could sense the echoes of time, as if the car itself carried stories from another era. This was exactly what he was looking for. Not just a car, but a symbol. "Need help with something, buddy?" A voice interrupted Shaq's thoughts. It belonged to Josh, a young salesman with a bored expression. Josh's gaze swept over Shaq in a quick assessment, lingering on the hoodie and worn sneakers. "That car isn't something just anyone can afford." Shaq gave a faint smile, his tone calm. "I was just curious. What model is it?" Josh sighed, clearly disinterested. 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. One of the rarest. I'll find someone to explain it to you. Without waiting for a reply, Josh turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Shaq standing alone. Shaq said nothing, continuing to study the car, but he couldn't ignore the low murmurs nearby. What's he doing here? Probably just wants some pictures to show off. He's in the wrong place if he thinks he can buy anything here. The words were soft but razor sharp, and though Shaq pretended not to hear, his gaze momentarily darkened. He was used to being judged by appearances, but that didn't make it any easier. In the distance, Richard finished his conversation with the client. His eyes returned to Shaq, brimming with curiosity and suspicion. With the confident gait of someone accustomed to being in charge, Richard began making his way toward Shaq, each step heavy with silent judgment. Shaq remained still, his eyes locked on the vintage car, seemingly captivated. But he had no idea that his imminent encounter with Richard would set off a chain of events brimming with tension and unexpected turns. Shaq gently reached out, letting his fingertips glide over the cool, glossy surface of the car. It wasn't just a car, it was a masterpiece. Every curve and detail of the 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost radiated timeless elegance. His eyes gleamed with admiration, but the quiet moment was abruptly broken by the echo of polished leather shoes tapping against the marble floor. Richard Morrison, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, approached Shaq. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning Shaq from head to toe as though assessing a cheap item. Unworthy of being in such a refined setting. Clearing his throat softly, Richard made his presence known. Shaq turned to face him, his expression composed. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep and polite. Richard's lips curled into a faint smirk, though the smile never reached his eyes. "Good morning. How may I assist you?" His tone was courteous, but the emphasis on assist carried a hint of mockery. "I'm quite interested in this car," Shaq replied calmly. "I'd like to know more about it." Richard raised an eyebrow, his gaze lingering on Shaq's modest attire. "This car," he began, his voice slow and deliberate, as if recounting a legend, "is one of the rarest vintage models in the world. Few have the privilege of even seeing it, and even fewer have the means to own it." Shaq nodded, showing neither embarrassment nor irritation. "That's fascinating. Could I get more details on its price and other information?" Richard crossed his arms, his demeanor turning colder. "Of course. But let me remind you first, this isn't a car for just anyone. We only deal with clients who truly understand its value, and naturally, those with the financial capability to acquire it." The air seemed to grow heavier. Shaq met Richard's gaze, unwavering. "Thank you. I understand." Richard was silent for a moment, then turned to Josh, a salesperson standing nearby who looked visibly uncomfortable about being summoned. "Josh, perhaps you could spend some time explaining the details of this vehicle to our guest," he said, his tone turning a simple instruction into a reluctant order. Josh sighed and ambled over, his reluctance barely concealed. "This car," he began briskly as though eager to finish the interaction, "is the 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, a special edition, premium leather interior, original engine, and—" He shrugged nonchalantly. "Everything else a high-end collector could expect." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Original engine? Does it still run well?" Josh let out a small laugh, devoid of warmth. "Run well? I wouldn't think of this as something you buy to drive around. It's more of a collector's item, for those who understand." Shaq gave a faint smile. "What about the price?" Josh hesitated before shaking his head. "You'd have to speak to the manager for specifics. This isn't the kind of car just anyone can buy. Let me fetch Richard for you." Turning on his heel, Josh walked off, but instead of calling Richard, he joined a group of employees near the reception desk. Low whispers soon followed, deliberately loud enough to be overheard. "Who does he think he is? Look at his clothes. No way he can afford that car. Probably just here to take pictures and brag." Shaq heard every word, but his expression remained calm. He didn't react, keeping his focus on the car, as though nothing else in the room mattered. Yet the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The whispers, mixed with soft snickers, felt like tiny blades pricking his dignity. Still, Shaq refused to let it faze him. Meanwhile, Richard observed the scene from a distance, his calculating eyes taking in every detail. He made no effort to intervene or correct his staff's behavior. Instead, he allowed a faint, self-satisfied smile to cross his lips, a smile that seemed to say he already knew Shaq didn't belong here. Shaq stood his ground, unfazed by the growing sense of alienation. Yet, in the depths of his gaze, there was a flicker of disappointment. He was well acquainted with men like Richard and Josh, people who judged others solely by their appearance. But their attitudes wouldn't deter him. Shaq hadn't come here to prove anything to them. He was here for something he truly valued, and he was determined to see it through. Shaq stood motionless beside the 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, his eyes intently scanning every detail on the car's body, as if imagining the history it carried. The serenity of the moment was quickly interrupted by the steady rhythm of leather shoes echoing on the stone floor. The steps were firm and confident, announcing their presence with purpose as Richard Morrison approached Shaq. Richard stopped a few paces away, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes, sharp as knives, swept over Shaq once more, this time with a thorough scrutiny. His gaze carried more than curiosity. It was an evaluative, almost dismissive look. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit with a gold watch gleaming on his wrist, Richard exuded an air of cold authority, a stark contrast to Shaq's simple demeanor. "Hello," Richard began, his deep voice deliberate and weighted, as if each word was carefully measured to emphasize that he spoke from a position of superiority. "I see you're interested in this car." Shaq turned, offering a polite nod and a courteous smile. "That's right. I've heard this is one of the rarest vintage models. I'm very intrigued by it." Richard's thin smile barely curved his lips, his eyes maintaining their frosty detachment. "You're correct. This is the 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, a true masterpiece. Very few people ever get the chance to see it, let alone own it." He emphasized the word own, his eyes narrowing slightly as they swept Shaq from head to toe. "We usually only deal with clients who truly understand its value." Shaq nodded, undeterred by Richard's veiled condescension. "I fully understand that. That's why I want to learn more about it and seriously consider purchasing it." Shaq's calm and assured response caught Richard off guard for a brief second. It was clear he hadn't anticipated such composure. Recovering quickly, Richard's lips curled into a faintly mocking smile. "I'm glad to hear you're serious," he said, his tone laced with subtle sarcasm. "But, as you know, this car isn't for just anyone. We have certain criteria when dealing with potential buyers. It's not just about the money, it's about suitability." Shaq's expression remained steady. "What are your criteria?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Richard's smirk deepened, as though he had been waiting for this question to deliver his unspoken judgment. "Criteria? They include strong financial capability, an appreciation for the car's true value, and, of course, the right style. This car is a symbol of status, not just a vehicle. We need to ensure that whoever owns it is truly deserving." Despite Richard's carefully veiled words, his disdain was apparent. He seemed to be suggesting that Shaq, with his modest attire and relaxed demeanor, was not worthy of owning such a masterpiece. Shaq smiled, but a flicker of determination appeared in his eyes. "I understand the value of this car very well, Mr. Morrison, and I'm here not to waste anyone's time. I'm quite serious about buying it." Shaq's clear, unwavering tone seemed to unsettle Richard for a moment. But, rather than back down, Richard stepped closer to Shaq, his eyes now openly challenging. "Are you serious?" Richard repeated, his voice slow and probing, as if testing Shaq's resolve. "Fine, but I should warn you, this car's worth exceeds that of a Beverly Hills mansion. It's not something for idle dreams or casual admiration." Shaq's steady gaze didn't waver under Richard's provocation. As I said, I'm not here to dream. I want this car." For a moment, Richard was silent, his piercing eyes searching Shaq's face for any sign of uncertainty. But all he found was a man standing firmly, unshaken. The realization seemed to unsettle Richard. He was unaccustomed to being challenged in a space where he always held control. "Very well," Richard said finally, his voice sharp like a blade. "I'll provide you with more details, but I hope you understand. We don't make a habit of wasting time on those who aren't qualified." Shaq didn't respond immediately. He met Richard's gaze, his eyes gleaming with an unusual mix of calm and strength. "I always respect other people's time, Mr. Morrison," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "I hope you'll do the same for me." For a split second, Richard hesitated. Instead of replying, he turned on his heel and signaled for Josh to bring additional information. A faint, inscrutable smile played on his lips, as though the real game had only just begun. Shaq remained where he was, his gaze shifting back to the Rolls-Royce. But the atmosphere around him had changed. The weight of condescension and judgment hung in, the air palpable yet unable to sway him. He knew he stood in a place where respect was not easily given, but that wouldn't stop him from getting what he wanted. Richard returned after reviewing some documents. In his hand was a thin file on the 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, but his demeanor remained unchanged, a smugness and concealed contempt hidden behind a polite smile. He placed the file on a nearby glass table and looked at Shaq with an expression that was half challenging, half mocking. "You know," Richard began, his voice drawn out as if emphasizing every word, "this car isn't just a means of transportation. It's a symbol of success, of class. Very few people get the opportunity to own one, and often, those who dare to dream about it don't truly understand what it represents." Shaq, maintaining a calm demeanor, stepped closer to the table. He glanced at the file but didn't touch it. "I understand your point," he said, his voice deep but steady. "I know the value of a classic car like this. I'm not here to dream. I'm here to buy." Shaq's response drew a slight chuckle from Richard, though it was anything but genuine. "You're serious?" Richard asked, his tone growing sharper. "Let me make this clear. This car is worth as much as a luxury estate in Beverly Hills,